everyone, Raptorspank here, and today we have Metacheck February 2nd. This is the show where I look at the meta and talk about a couple of decks I find interesting. First off though, this is a patch week, so I'm going to talk about the patch first, and then after that I'm going to give an update on Fizzlusives from last week's On the Grind, which I have a pretty big update on that deck, so that'll be a nice good one. But first I want to talk about the patch because I think that's good to go over that before we talk about the meta and where the meta will be and all that stuff. So first off, let's look at the newest patch for Legends of Runeterra. So what is in patch 2.1? A lot of stuff. I've looked over it briefly, but here's my big dive into it. We have a new event coming, so that ought to be exciting. All the events they've done so far have been good, so looking forward to this. I'm going to assume it's the same kind of battle pass sort of thing, so that's cool. Looks like it's a bit smaller than previous ones, but we'll see for sure. But let's dive straight into the meat of it, which is the card updates. First off, changes to Misfortune. This is probably one of the biggest changes in this patch. Taking Overwhelm off of leveled up Misfortune is so game-changing because the biggest problem with her is that chump blocking didn't work. She kills whatever blocks, and then she still gets the damage through because she has Overwhelm. So taking that away is a huge nerf to Misfortune decks, particularly Plaza Scout decks. This won't affect Bilgewater Burn in the slightest bit. I've said many times that Bilgewater Burn actually does not care about leveling up Misfortune, and almost never accomplishes it. So you're not going to care about that if you're playing Bilgewater Burn. This is a huge nerf for Plaza Scouts. Leveled up Misfortune happened a lot, and it was usually if you could level up your Misfortune, you won the game right then and there. Usually. Taking away Overwhelm totally changes that, though. Now, she's so easy to chump block, and Plaza Scouts doesn't have a lot of Overwhelmers in general, so she was pretty much the only one. Not being able to Overwhelm now with her means that should change the deck quite a bit. That's a hefty hit. And I'll go over in a little more details why this could be even more important for the state of the game. The changes to Victor are, it's small. I think it's warranted. I think Victor's too hard to level up, so making him a little bit easier to level up, definitely ideal, I would say. And the Hex Core on play is actually huge. Like, it needed that. I'm not worried about Victor being problematic now, but I think he's going to be a little more playable now. I think you can definitely build a Victor deck and be in much better shape than you were before. I think he deserved to have that Hex Core upgrade on play, so that's good that they did that. Kind of predictable change to Grand Plaza, and right now I am perfectly okay with this. The one extra health was pretty huge. There's a number of times that's been really problematic for me is when they play the Grizzled Ranger and it gets that extra health, because the difference between 1 and 2 is actually pretty massive, and they can survive a lot of attacks that they normally shouldn't be able to. So I think the Challenger and the +1 is good enough for Grand Plaza to see play, but I think the extra health was a bit much. So I think this change is good, and this is another thing that's going to hit Plaza Scouts kind of hard. The extra health was important in a number of matchups for just basically making your deck unfair and just ensuring that your opponent can't fight through it. So, yeah, not being able to do that anymore is going to be pretty critical, especially into like Ezreal Draven matchups and things like that, where you're going to be seeing Piltover base removal. The extra health, losing it's actually pretty huge. So, yeah, I think that's a good change. I think it's warranted, and I think Grand Plaza serves a good purpose. It's created a lot of interesting decks that didn't exist before, things like the whole Starry Scamp, Zoe, Targon Plaza kind of deck. Like, that wouldn't exist without Grand Plaza. So I think it does fit a good niche, but I think it needed to be nerfed. So I think this is for the best, and obviously Plaza Scout's getting pretty hammered. This change to War Chefs is great because War Chef's a garbage card since they changed it. I originally didn't think it was going to be that bad, but yeah, it is. It's been terrible. And 2 power should help quite a bit. Losing the health is still bad. Honestly, I'm not even sure War Chefs deserves the nerf anymore because it's kind of gotten power creeped a bit, but yeah, I think this is fine. I think this is a good change. I think you could see War Chef played a bit more now, so this is probably the ideal place to put that card, so that seems fine. I still don't think it's really going to replace anything in Plaza Scouts. which was probably its best chance at replacing anything, but maybe it would be good for like a Zed Lulu support deck, that kind of thing. So you might see that pop up, but otherwise, I don't think we're going to see play out of it, but I do think it's a good change. Homecoming, we're still not going to see play. It's still a terrible card. Making it cheaper is probably ideal, but honestly, I still probably wouldn't play this card at 3 mana. Even at fast speed, recalling your own ally is so problematic. Essentially, the best this is going to be is like a double-sided Will of Ionia. Save one of your units and bounce one of theirs. So when you're going to get value out of both of those, or bouncing a landmark, whatever, when you're going to get value out of both halves of that, this is going to be decent. But if you're using it as removal, where you're just recalling something to bounce something else, it's going to be terrible. Because then they just kill your unit, and now you lost your unit and didn't bounce their unit, and it's only a one-turn removal anyways that bounces it to hand, so yeah, it's still not a great card, but making it cheaper is fine then. That'll help it, but again, I still think it's probably too expensive for me to ever run, but we'll see. Green Glade Elder, another great change. Don't think it'll see play, but being a 1/1 for 3 mana is just absolutely terrible. So a 3/1 at least means it can be pretty aggressive on its own, so that could happen. Changes to Captain Farron. I think this is probably fair. It's a great closeout card. This will hurt Ezreal Draven a bit. I don't think it will be that devastating, but only time will tell. Generally speaking, it never mattered if I had 3 decimates. In fact, usually 1 decimate was enough, so dropping it to 2 is perfectly fine. I think those decks will still be okay with it. I think Captain Farron will still see a lot of play as a good finisher, but I do think it will make him slightly less oppressive, and that's probably for the best. And it gives you less discard fodder for like an Ezreal or for like Rummage, etc. So yeah, I think that's probably a fair nerf. I wouldn't expect it to hit Ezreal Draven that hard. You're still probably going to be running at least 2 Farrons, so I think that's for the best. Same goes for Blade of the Exile. Making it 1 cost, way better. The amount of hoops you have to jump through to even get Blade of the Exile is just making it cost 3 mana at slow speed was just that was brutal. So, you know, making it cheaper is just for the best. It's the best thing they could have done for it. Blade Squire, also probably a decent change. It's reasonably aggressive now, so it's a decent 1-drop, and if it dies, you get value out of it. So, yeah, I could see Blade Squire go up in play, but the real question is if these changes are enough to make Riven good, and I'm not so convinced. But yeah, that's a good change to Blade Squire. It makes it a pretty easy include for a Riven deck now, where you don't have to worry about being too weak. Changes to Hush. I'll talk about this more in a little bit, but in a vacuum, I think this is great. Hush is definitely a problem card, and we're really seeing that where it's really impressive what it does, and it answers so many different strategies. So as it turns out, a 1-turn answer is actually good enough for so many decks. So having that be 3 mana is probably fair. Whereas Purify can only hit followers, and it's a permanent effect, but I think that's enough to make Purify a 2 cost and Hush a 3 cost. I think that's fair. And since Targon's a part of so many problematic decks, I think it's more concerning than a card like Purify. So, yeah, I think in a vacuum it's fine. Pale Cascade, I've been expecting this nerf for a while, so I'm not terribly surprised by this. It will definitely hurt some decks. Nightfall aggro jumps to mind. It'll hit Lee Sin a little bit. Maybe even a decent bit. But it's definitely, you're going to see it less in stuff like control decks. Like Vimer Control probably drops Pale Cascade now. It's still a decent card, so you could consider carrying it, but with 1 less power, I'm not sure I would run it. It's decent for saving things, but it's overall pretty weak. So I think you'll see a lot of decks that just ran it because it was an incredible utility card. They'll start dropping it now. But otherwise, it's still a decent card because it's burst speed +1/+1, so it gives them health. And if you've got Nightfall, which is fairly easy to trigger, then it's going to draw you a new card too, so that's good. Before I move on, though, I have to talk about this. Not touching Lee Sin is terrible game design. I have nothing else to say on that matter. I have never been so disappointed in so many good changes. Everything in this patch was what we needed, Except there's no answer to Lee Sin. And in fact, I think Lee Sin is going to be more problematic now than he was before for a couple of reasons. Hush being nerfed is a buff for Lee Sin. Even though it was a pretty dominant removal in Lee Sin decks, you're fine taking that trade. It's harder for your opponent to hush your Lee Sin. That's just always going to be good. Pale Cascade is an actual nerf for Lee Sin. One less power can be the difference when you're trying to set up the one-turn combo kill, but there's still so many ways to accomplish it. And the fact that it draws you cards, it's still probably worth including. The biggest hit that Pale Cascade will do to the Lee Sin deck is that its early game is going to be substantially worse. Things like blocking a Misfortune with your Eye of the Dragon and then Pale Cascading it to force the trade, or a variety of different things that could attack, and doing that to, say, keep Eye of the Dragon alive while killing something and producing a Dragonling next turn. That's going to be harder to do those plays, so that will hurt it as well. But the big thing is, Plaza Scouts was a great deck for keeping Lee Sin in check. Misfortune was really good against it because it would wipe out the Dragonling, so that wouldn't work for stalling out the game, so they could just keep swinging in. And with Overwhelm, even if you chump blocked, Misfortune was still going to deal a ton of damage. The nerfs to Misfortune, the nerfs to Grand Plaza are buffs to Lee Sin in the metagame. It is. And so Lee Sin was already a problem. It's still going to be a problem, and honestly, it's shameful that they didn't catch that. I don't want to be too incendiary here, but Lee Sin has been a problem for months now, and the fact that they can't fix that is ridiculous. I also notice they talked that they were going to start putting deck information and meta statistics in with their patches. Guess that's not happening anymore. I would love to see it. Obviously, I would expect the win rate on Zoe Lee Sin to be lower because of the fact that it is a relatively skilled deck, and so there will be a lot of people who pick it up because it's one of the best decks in the meta and then don't do well with it, and that'll tank the rating a bit. But it's weird that they didn't touch it at all, and they're not even talking about win rates anymore. That's very unfortunate, and just in general, Lee Sin needs an answer, and it should not be taking them this long. And if they're going to continue pushing balance patches out to like 3 to 4 weeks or longer in between balance patches, they need to start actually answering a lot of things, even more than this, to be frank. But at least the rest of the changes here are all good. The problem being that they do inadvertently make Lee Sin better, and that's just going to make the problem worse. But this is what should have happened to Misfortune and should have happened to Grand Plaza in a vacuum. So it's what should have happened to Hush in a vacuum, but now with Lee Sin not being answered in the slightest bit, nerfing Hush is just insane. Because that's the only thing keeping him in line. And even then, it still doesn't work that well. Again, I had a game of Vimer Control in which I had double Hush, and I still lost to Lee Sin. So, yeah. Nerfing it's baffling when you're not going to touch Lee Sin the slightest. I'm also a little bit disappointed in when we get to Labs here. I'm excited for Lab of Legends, but I'm a little sad we didn't get a different multiplayer mode that we're still on United Front, mostly because United Front doesn't have great replayability. There's a very small champion pool, so once you've played a decent bit of it, you've kind of seen it all. I would have liked to see, at the very least, if they were going to keep it United Front, they could have put in another champion or two just to keep it fresh. So disappointed in that, but otherwise, it's totally fine. Alright, the board, Guardian, all that stuff looks pretty sweet. Card backs look great. I love these card backs, especially the Misfortune one's pretty sweet. I love the colors on this. The Lunar Beast is going to be funny to use. I just love the colors that they went with for this event. The emotes look pretty great. That looks like that might finally replace the Soraka emote for me. We'll see. Yeah, it's some pretty good stuff. A new T-Hex. I haven't been using T-Hex as much now that I've been using Nightshade Dragonling, but I might have to get the bundle just to get that T-Hex. We'll see. But yeah, that's the big changes for this patch. Like I said, should have banned or should have nerfed Lee Sin. That's a big failure on their part for doing that, and unfortunately, it makes a bunch of really great changes a lot worse in retrospect. They were the changes that needed to happen, but Lee Sin needed to be addressed too, and unfortunately, they dropped the ball again. But that said, a lot of the other changes are exactly what needed to happen, so I'm pretty excited about that. So I guess that'll bring us into our meta update on Fizzlusives. So, where are we at with Fizzlusives? I think this is my biggest update yet. So, for anyone who didn't see the video, at the end of it, I was 4-2 when I finished recording. By the time I actually did the outro and posted the video, I was 6-5, which was a very disappointing win rate with the deck. And I voiced at the time that I thought if I put more time into the deck, the win rate would go better. And I was absolutely correct. Since recording, I have put 15 games into Fizzlusives, and I've gone 11-4. And one of those losses, the game froze and crashed before I was going to win. So it really should be 12-3, but 11-4 is still a 73% win rate, which brings the overall to 17-9 for 65%. But as you can see, it is climbing. And it hasn't been nerfed. Nothing hit it. And Lee Sin still exists, which, while I've only played it the 2 games, and I lost both times to it, so that matchup might not be great for Fizzlusives. The big thing is, Lee Sin forces out control decks. I've mentioned this a couple of times in different Metachecks and on the grind episodes, but Lee Sin means you can't really have good control decks, because Lee Sin will just stop that matchup every time, and it's common enough that a lot of control decks get forced out, and that's the best answer to Fizzlusive, things that are going to do cards like Withering Wail. And although I did hit peak control with the deck and I beat it, so I guess that's not even that bad either. The big losses were to aggro decks. Again, I mentioned this in On the Grind, but aggro decks are going to be some of the harder matchups because they can race us, and so that can be very hard to beat them. In fact, the last game I played, I did lose to NPZ Teemo Burn because they got me down to 6. Or I had them down to 6. They had me down to 6. I could swing, but they could block all my stuff pretty much. And I could either go for a rally effect to get a second attack, which would be lethal if they didn't have a way to kill me, or I could leave Get Excited up to kill something in response to an Noxian Fervor. But if I do that, I'm going into the next turn and just hoping they don't have any burn, which is almost certainly not going to happen. So I went for the rally effect. They had the Noxian Fervor. Died to that, but that's how most aggro matches are going to go. They're going to be very, very close, down to the wire, and you're either going to have more than they do or not. And that's just how it's going to go. Really good against mid-range decks. I hit Plaza Scouts again. I won with Mind Meld again. It's just so good for the mid-range matchups. It's insane. Not to mention the fact that just Elusives in general is really good for that. So the deck definitely oppressing right now. I've played a ton of different decks. I was 7-1 starting out, and those were all unique games. Not a single repeat. So I played a bunch of different decks in the meta, a couple of non-meta weird fringe decks, but mostly meta decks. Stuff like Lucian Hackerum, Plaza Scouts, Fiora Shen I've played against, Bilgewater Burn, Discard Aggro, Nightfall Aggro, MPZ Burn, Ezreal Draven, a lot of stuff like that, and it's been crushing it. So I highly recommend that deck. I think it'll still be good through this patch because nothing has affected those cards. So unless Lee Sin drops off the face of the earth and Control comes back and is amazing, yeah, it's a good deck, and I would highly recommend it. General thoughts on the meta? I mentioned that basically in the last one, but some decks that I still expect to be good. Control's still going to be bad, I think, because there's no buffs to Control or any Control strategies, so I don't think Victor's going to be good. So I think we're going to be basically with the same meta, just maybe minus Plaza Scouts, or Plaza Scouts is going to get pushed down a little bit, I think, by these changes, so maybe Fiora Shen is the better way to go if you're on the mid-range Demacia plan, but yeah, I expect the meta to not really change much, despite all of these crazy changes and really good changes. Lee Sin's still going to be the deck to beat, and that's going to force the rest of the meta to warp around it, which is what has happened for the last month and what has resulted in the meta we currently have. So I expect that meta to still be the same meta going forward because you still have to beat Zoe Lee Sin, and that's just how it's going to be. So I expect the meta to stay largely the same despite some amazing nerfs. We'll see if that ends up being the case, but yeah, I still expect Ezreal Draven to be good. I don't think the Farron nerf's big enough to make it bad. I think it's just a fair nerf. But I think you rarely ever needed the third Decimate in any Captain Farron deck because that's just so much mana and so many turns out. That really only was relevant in the Control matchups, and as I said, Control's terrible, so I wouldn't expect to see it. But yeah, I think the meta will stay about where it was. So we've all played it. We've all seen it. I expect more of the same. Aphelios could mess with that a little bit, but we'll see. I don't really anticipate a lot out of him, but that might be a huge mistake on my part. We'll see. But I don't think anything else will change. So now let's talk about the decks for this week. I'm only going to cover 2 decks because it was a patch week, so the video's already long enough as it is. I don't want to really drag it out for you guys. So first deck I'm talking about, since I mentioned it in the meta update, Fiora Shen. It's been a few weeks since I've covered the deck, so here's the list I currently have set, and this deck is one of the ones I have earmarked for being the most likely to be chosen to grind out the end of my season for me. Is that this deck is really, really good. I have had many qualms with this deck in the past, not for it being bad, but rather because it's too good. But that said, that's a good reason to play the deck, is that it is probably good, and it does do decently against Zoe Lee Sin, essentially, since you have a number of ways to protect your own stuff to keep it from dying. You have things like Concerted Strike, which can be really good for dealing with Lee Sin, because you can have one thing strike Lee Sin first, then have a second. So if the second can kill Lee Sin on its own, the first one strips the barrier, the second one kills Lee Sin. Deny works against Dragon's Rage, so that's really, really strong. And this can just aggro them down, depending on the setup. And things like Fleet Feather Tracker can ensure that Zoe doesn't live. So it's just got a lot of really strong mid-range power that kind of does well in the matchup in a similar vein to Plaza Scouts, although it's not quite as aggressive, not quite as quick. But the basic general gist of this deck is you are a mid-range deck. You're looking to win in the mid to late game, depending on the matchup. Against aggro, you're going to want to just go wide with the board. Keep your stuff alive as much as you can, but just try to slow them down, essentially, and then use things like Spirit's Refuge to gain yourself up a bunch of health. Another great thing to go into the aggro matchup is that a lot of aggro decks are going to have a hard time dealing with Fiora. So things like Fizzlusives, Discard Aggro, those are great decks for Fiora because they're only going to have very few ways to kill her, like 3 tops usually. So being able to play around those things is it's not that hard to do. So they have a lot of small things she can kill. So winning through Fiora is actually very possible in those matchups. Into the mid-range matchup, you're just going to try to outvalue them, go with a bigger board, use things to break the symmetry. We have a lot of barriers, so that's typically the way we can break symmetry pretty well. You can keep denies up for Concerted Strikes, use Concerted Strike yourself in response. Basically, we're probably not going to be the fastest mid-range deck, but we should have a better late game than most mid-range decks thanks to Brightsteel Formation. Brightsteel Formation pretty much shuts down any other mid-range deck because they just don't have a way to deal with it, especially by the time it comes down. They've burned most of their removal. It's just going to lock them out of the game. So that's one of the best things for the mid-range. Against Control, try to be as fast as you can. Greenglade Caretaker should be pretty good here. Fleet Feather, I mean, you'll still keep it just for the aggro, but that dies to a lot of things that Caretaker doesn't. So Caretaker's really, really strong. River Shaper's insane in the Control matchup because it keeps your hand full, as full, or even more full than them. And then Deny is always going to be really great for shutting down something like Ruination or Vengeance. So just keep that in mind while trying to pressure your opponent as fast as possible. This is primarily a mid-range deck. It can be very aggro. It can win through combo as well because of Fiora and a lot of ways to enable her. So that's usually the biggest trouble when trying to deal with this deck, is that it can beat you through combo or mid-range. So if you try to beat one aspect of it, you usually lose to the other, and that's the advantage we get by playing the deck. So it's definitely a good one to keep an eye on if you're planning to grind out a bunch more ranked games. This is a solid pick, and it hasn't been hit in any way. It already wasn't a Grand Plaza deck, so it's set, it's solid, it hasn't lost any bit of steam going into this next meta. And then the next deck, and the last deck for this week, is something a lot more interesting, a lot more spicy, and that is Snow Ezreal, or Frozen Ezreal, whatever you want to call it. This deck has not been meta in a very, very long time. I used to hate this deck in beta, and that really tells you the state of the game, that this is nowhere near as degenerate a combo deck as some of the other ones out there, and it used to be the most annoying. And part of that's the Ezreal nerf really helped to bring this deck in line. But what it basically is, this is probably the most Ezreal deck you could be playing right now, although it's still not even an Ezreal deck. I would actually say Puffcap Peddler is probably the best card in this deck, but this is a mushroom deck. You are looking to kill your opponent through mushrooms. That's the number one way you're going to win. It just happens to enable Ezreal really, really well, and it does decent into Lee Sin, because as you may notice, we have 2 Flash Freezes, we have 2 Harsh Winds, we have Troll Chant to lower power. If we can get their health low enough, we can do something like Brittle Steel. We have a bunch of Piltover base removal as well. We've got Thermogenic, which can catch a Lee Sin that's not careful out by stripping the barrier off it and then Thermogenic beaming it. So it's got a lot of ways to deal with Lee Sin in that regard. Aggro's going to be a little bit sketchier because of the fact that we don't have many units, but we have a lot of good removal, things like Static Shock. We have a lot of cheap Frostbite spells like Brittle Steel, so we've got Thermogenic for turn 1, and basically your goal here is just to keep preventing your opponent from dealing damage while loading their deck with a ton of mushrooms. Hexcore, Foundry, and Veteran Investigators are great ways to kill your opponent once you've loaded their deck with mushrooms, and basically you just want to set it up that if you ever get a hit in with a level 2 Teemo, your opponent is like dead. They have so many mushrooms in their deck, and it's so easy to do that. Land 1 Puffcap Peddler, a Chump Wump, and now right there you just planted 14 mushrooms in their deck off of 2 cards. So we have a lot of ways to do it really, really well. And once you start getting like multiple Puffcap Peddlers, you'll start to see just how crazy this deck can be. It is definitely a lot more fringe. I wouldn't necessarily say this is the best deck in the format, but it's one I'm definitely going to be playing more of and keeping an eye on to see if it can carve its own little spot out, because again, I do think it can hold its own decently against aggro. That's probably the matchup that's going to be the worst. Against control, they're going to be drawing a bunch of cards, so we're going to deal a bunch of damage. Against Lee Sin, we can just keep freezing Lee Sin to prevent us from dying to the combo kill. We can kill Zoe with a bunch of Piltover removal. So it's just, it's a lot of value, and it honestly could be a lot better into the metagame, because the big reason for including this is what this deck is going to struggle against the most is going to be mid-range decks because of the lack of board wipes. Because Freljord and Piltover just don't have them. So that's the biggest concern. And Plaza Scouts getting nerfed really does change that factor quite a bit. So I think there is a very real possibility that you could grind an opponent out even to a mid-range matchup where you're probably going to be the most scared. So I think there's a possibility for this deck to spike. I don't really expect it to right now, but it's definitely something I'm looking at. So again, against aggro, look for your early answers, stuff like Mystic Shot, Thermogenic Beam, Brittle Steel. Iceveil Archer can be really strong. Ezreal is great because they probably won't have a lot of ways to remove Ezreal, so he can just keep sniping stuff every turn, potentially. Teemo's not going to be good, or not going to be great. You can always use him as a chump blocker, but that's not ideal. Static Shock should be good in those matchups. Against mid-range, definitely look for good value cards. Drawing cards for your opponent becomes a bit of a problem, but Iceveil Archer is going to be really good because it can trade with pretty much anything. Puffcap Peddler is going to be really good. Chump Wump's going to be really good. That package, and then just while trading effectively or using Frostbite to basically Frostbite their unit, block with a Puffcap Peddler, so you keep your Peddler and their unit dies. You're just going to look for good trades like that and just try to get as many mushrooms into your opponent's deck as you can so that hopefully that burns them out before they can kill you. That's how the mid-range matchup's going to usually look. Against control, really just try to cram mushrooms in their deck. Try to make sure that if you're playing a Puffcap Peddler, you have mana to put mushrooms in their deck. If you're playing a Teemo, you've got some way to keep it alive. Just keep forcing mushrooms into their deck, and that should win out the game. Also, a flipped Ezreal is going to chip a bunch of damage in too, so that's something to keep in mind and look for. But just try to cram their deck full of mushrooms as fast as you can, because otherwise we're not going to play a good ground game against them, most likely. So that's your best bet for trying to win that matchup. So those are the decks for this week. Thanks for watching the video. If you like any of these decks that you've seen, whether it be Fizzlusives, Snow Ezreal, or Fiora Shen, I've got links in the description for all 3 of them. And yeah, if you enjoyed the video, leave a like, comment below, and subscribe for more videos just like it.